Hi guys, I'll be discussing Chapter 18, Positive Reinforcement in Institutions, from Sidman's Coercion and its Fallout. Sidman starts out the chapter by discussing institutionalized coercion. He says that institutions are typically built or located in unpopulated or hard-to-reach areas. This is done intentionally to keep those that have been institutionalized out of sight. It plays into the old saying, out of sight, out of mind, which Sidman says is an avoidance reaction from the community. Because these individuals and the institutions are often ignored by the public, they are without much control from the outside. Sidman says that within institutions, immediate priorities such as staff convenience, docility of the individuals, and obedience preside over long-term goals such as rehabilitation or education. This leads to coercion being a means for gaining obedience, and it also leads to a disregard for the negative effects of coercion. He says that public pressure for reform in institutions is often short-lived and ineffective because it focuses on the facilities themselves and administrative procedures. Often behavior management techniques are not analyzed or investigated, and due to misunderstandings or incompetence, even positive reinforcement can be used as a means of coercion in institutions. Sidman goes on to discuss deprivation and the misuse of deprivation in institutions. He says that those in positions of authority are accustomed to using coercion. They see positive reinforcement as taking something away as punishment and then giving it back to reinforce desirable behaviors. In prison, Sidman gives the examples of solitary confinement, food deprivation, a lack of privacy, or menial jobs. So these are all ways that people can be deprived of basic needs, and then they're offered those things back in order to reinforce desirable behaviors. But as soon as they start displaying any undesirable behaviors, those needs or resources are taken away. He says that this is coercive. Imposing deprivation can lead to escape or avoidance behaviors. He says that deprivation does contribute to how effective a positive reinforcer may be. Here Sidman's discussing or referring to motivating operations. He gives the example of food. So if you've just had a meal, you are not likely to be as motivated by food, and it won't be as effective of a reinforcer for desirable behavior as opposed to if it's been several hours since you've last eaten. He also gives the example of money. He says that how we spend money really depends a lot on how much we already have. Sidman says that although deprivation can make reinforcers more effective, it is not necessary for the use of positive reinforcement. He says that deprivation should only be used to increase the effectiveness of a reinforcer and not as a punishment. Depriving and then offering items deprived of as reinforcers and then taking them away again subverts the principles of positive reinforcement. Also, those that are being deprived may attempt escape resistance or counter-control measures. He says that it is more effective to make use of deprivation that occurs naturally because deprivation is biologically built in. It can be effectively used to increase the power of a positive reinforcer. Sidman says that food is one of the most reliable reinforcers, and the deprivation of food occurs naturally. This is because we're typically not constantly eating, so at some point it probably has been a couple hours since your last meal, and at that point food is going to be much more likely to reinforce your behavior than it would be if you're satiated or you've just had a meal. Sidman says that we wouldn't deprive students who didn't perform well of a meal. However, they can perform skills that they already know how to do to earn a full meal. He says that we can conduct learning surrounding meals and increase adaptive functioning at other times as well. So he gives the example of teaching skills necessary to get through a meal time, and how you can use this to take students out to restaurants, which provides new opportunities and experiences. He says that then you can move to teaching safe travel skills on the way there. What Sidman's really talking about here is a behavioral cusp. So by teaching a skill or a set of skills, you're opening up new opportunities for learning and experiences. Sidman says that the individual may even learn to associate signs of approval as a signal that reinforcement is coming, and these signs can eventually become condition reinforcers. At that point, you no longer have to conduct all of your training or learning sessions surrounding a meal, but you can have meals serve as more of a leisure time or a social opportunity. So what Sidman's basically saying is food is just a place to start. Sidman goes on to discuss timeout and how it can be abused. Timeout is a removal of reinforcers, so in behavior analysis we call this negative punishment. He says that it is socially imposed deprivation. Timeout can range from a child being forced to stand in a corner to punish undesirable behaviors, to solitary confinement in prison, where they're taking away all social interaction. Sidman says that timeout can be effectively used to teach a child no, which is an important skill for their safety, and it's a harmless way to teach the concept. However, Sidman cautions that timeout can be coercive if it's used in abundance or taken to extremes. Timeout is usually a preferable option because it is painless and seen as benign. That's often how institutions may justify sedating patients rather than using physical restraints on them. Sidman says that while these methods might not be cruel themselves, the outcome of them is, and it removes contact from reinforcers that give life meaning or purpose. He says that the only way learning can occur when you're abusing timeout or negative punishment surrounds escape and avoidance, and that can ultimately lead to depression. Sidman says that it's important to remember that timeout only works as a punisher if the environment that you're removing the individual from was reinforcing to begin with. Otherwise, you're running the risk of reinforcing problem behaviors. Sidman says that even the physical act of removing a child from an environment can be reinforcing. If you're giving the child attention or picking them up and carrying them away, that could serve as a reinforcer, and it could also ultimately turn timeouts into reinforcers. Sidman says that we should arrange learning environments and teaching so that nearly all behavior that occurs can be reinforced. He goes on to say that effective teaching can eliminate the need for a punishment. Sidman goes on in this chapter to discuss how prisons can serve as learning environments. A majority of those youths who have been incarcerated had limited adaptive skills and a lot of undesirable behaviors in their repertoire before their incarceration. This is due to socially imposed deprivations, according to Sidman. While crime is not exclusive to those in lower socioeconomic levels, it is more common in impoverished communities that lack opportunities for social or economic mobility. He says that in these areas, there's no value seen in or reinforcement for skills past the basics for survival. As a result, these people have limited skill sets and limited ambitions. Their lives typically revolve around the basics, such as food, shelter, and sex, and may come to revolve around alcohol and drugs and the money that they need to acquire those things. They learn the simplest ways to access these reinforcers are to take them from others. He says that youths who are incarcerated and released, having learned no new skill sets except lessening their chances of being caught again in the future. Unfortunately, a majority of incarcerated youths are caught again and reincarcerated. He says that the threat of returning to prison was obviously not punishing enough to keep them from engaging in the criminal activities again. Sidman says that this is expected because coercive control doesn't provide alternatives to criminals who lack social desirable competencies. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of behavior analysis in problem solving for the complex problem of criminality, even though behavior analysis is extended to many other kinds of human behavior, and there's little evidence to suggest that it couldn't be a solution. There are two big factors why Sidman thinks that this could be so. He says that it's nearly impossible to redesign the environment from which criminality comes, and it's difficult to control the availability of critical reinforcers. Our current punishment system's inability to prevent repetitive crime is a lost opportunity, according to Sidman. He says that positive reinforcement could be used to teach skills while prisoners are unable to engage in activities that led to their incarceration. This would lead to prisoners being equipped with skills so that when they are released, they are able to survive and obtain reinforcers without engaging in criminal activities. That would ultimately reduce repeat offenders and would decrease the need for new prisons. However, there's a lot of skepticism surrounding the concept that prison could serve as an opportunity for education and a lack of success in attempts. This, according to Sidman, comes from the idea that teaching can only be achieved through coercive measures. He says that we could design a learning program that includes an abundance of positive reinforcement, and it would ultimately be less costly in the long run than maintaining the current standard, which is the use of coercion. Sidman gives an example of how positive reinforcement has been effectively used to expand the behavioral repertoires of juvenile offenders. He talks about an example where prisoners were essentially paid for learning. They signed up for classes and received credits for high scores. These credits could be used to obtain a private space, and credits could also be used to obtain resources. Credits were essentially like money that could be spent in a store. He said that it was set up like a job. Those who didn't want to participate didn't have to, but those who did could see it as a job. And the private ownership that came with it resulted in new reinforcers. Sidman said that in this example, newly learned skills made reinforcers from the store more valuable. He gave the example of stationery and writing utensils because the prisoners could write. They were interested in writing letters. He said that their ability to interview made nicer clothing more desirable because they might be preparing for interviews in the near future. Eventually, students were able to buy privileges such as phone calls, private visits, or trips outside of the prison. And learning itself eventually became valuable. Some prisoners were even using credits to pay for courses. He says that the evidence shows that following their release, more took advantage of the new opportunities the program opened up, and fewer of those inmates returned to prison. Sidman concludes the chapter by saying we should be investing in at-risk youth before they're imprisoned. My question is, Sidman gave his opinion of why society is skeptical of using positive reinforcement to rehabilitate prisoners. Do you have any other ideas about why we maintain a system that isn't working? Thanks for watching.